Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism, a podcast produced by the program on extremism at George Washington University. And we are also accompanied today by one of our fellows, who is an expert on the right wing in the United States, as we are going to discuss today the right wing and antisemitism, which is a very big problem, not only in the United States, but also across the globe. Jon, welcome.
Thank you, Omar. It's wonderful to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. I am a research fellow with the program on extremism at George Washington University. I have largely focused on the far-right extremist threat landscape, with a particular focus in white supremacist and anti-government movements, as well as the evolution of specific groups and federal responses to that threat.
Thank you for joining us, Jon. As I usually do with every episode, I ask the question because I believe it's very important to establish the foundation of the discussion about anti-Semitism, which is, what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. I think, quite simply, it's hatred of Jews, of the Jewish people. I would largely hew to the State Department definition, as previous guests have stated, which does really focus in on those manifestations of anti-Semitism, whether it's physical, online, offline, which are expressions of hate, expressions of anti-Semitism directed either at Jewish or non-Jewish individuals, institutions, religious facilities. But I think, it's quite simple when you really boil it all down. It's hatred of the Jewish people.
As we are focused on the right wing today, Jon, I think it's very important for us to establish a context. I mean, what is the right wing in the United States? Who are they? What's happening there?
So I would first, of course, have to contextualize this and say that given the unique protections on speech, on assembly in the United States, we have a very difficult threat landscape when we talk about right-wing extremism. There is, of course, no legal challenges to being an extremist, whether it's right-wing, left-wing, or just an anti-Semitic extremist of any kind. But when we attempt to bucket, or as we see the government definitions attempt to trace the groups that are present here, what we really see are white supremacist movements, which are largely, in this modern era, largely post-organization, really decentralized, disparate online networks of racist, anti-Semitic individuals who form these coalitional movements, both across the country and transnationally. And along with the white supremacist, or what the government calls racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV, they also speak extensively on anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism, or agave, as the government definition really lays out there. And so what we've seen, especially in this post-Oklahoma City bombing, post-9/11 landscape, is a blurring of those ideological lines. As we've seen the formalized groups fade away out of the public spaces, we see a blurring where white supremacist, anti-government individuals may intersect, may form these coalitions. They will pull in a wide variety of like-minded individuals, whether it's individuals who identify as incels or members of the Boogaloo movement or any of these various brands that have come to take up space in this American far right, whether it's the Goyim Defense League, Blood Tribe, Active Clubs, White Lives Matter. These are all, hardly organizations, but they're symptoms of the disease, right? And they show, I think, how far-reaching the anti-Semitic, hateful core of this ideology has spread across the country.
Jon, what was the state of anti-Semitism among these? I mean, I understand that most of them have anti-Semitism at the foundation of their ideology. But what was the situation of anti-Semitism among these groups before October 7? I ask this question because I need to understand later on what happened after October 7.
Absolutely. I think it's hard to look at right-wing extremism in the United States without stumbling upon some anti-Semitic conspiracy when you look at many of the deadliest acts of mass violence that have been perpetrated by right-wing extremists in this country in recent years, whether we're talking about the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, whether we're talking about the shooting at the synagogue in Poway, whether we're talking about the mass shooting in El Paso in 2019 or at the Top supermarket in Buffalo in 2022. The commonality across all of those shootings is anti-Semitic conspiracies. It's deeply hateful conspiracies like the Great Replacement Theory, which posits that globalists, in quotes, which obviously refers to Jews, refers to the deep state, and connects them up and argues that there is this global conspiracy to replace the white Christian population in this country with non-white immigrants. And at the center of each and every one of those conspiracies, inevitably, is Jews, is a hatred of Jews, is connecting immigration to George Soros, is arguing that somehow, Jewish aid organizations that are attempting to help immigrants are part of this conspiracy. And so no matter how far out you go, at the core of nearly every single one of these acts of hatred, as the mobilizing concepts that inspire so many individuals to fall down that rabbit hole into right-wing violent extremism, the hatred of the Jews, hatred of Jewish people, is almost always at the core of those movements. And I think it's important to say that even when anti-Semitism is not the primary driver, the most overt manifestation of that group's purpose, you still see anti-Semitic conspiracies creeping in, even if it's just passive. When you look at a group like the Oath Keepers, for example, you see many of their conspiracies talking about this globalist deep state, this new world order, the Zionist occupied government. And that's language that is not out of place in the most overt neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic online and offline spaces that we've seen become so popular in recent years.
You mentioned the Zionist occupying government. It's also important to mention here that I remember when I was talking to my students about the conspiracy theories of also jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda also does believe in the Zionist occupying government or the abbreviation OG. How did the situation change post October 7? Or I think the question should be, what was the response of the right-wing extremist groups to October 7?
So early on, what you saw was a very concerning trend of glorification and celebration of mass brutal violence against Jews. You had individuals, significant members of these far-right groups who were live streaming videos that were taken by militants from October 7th. We're celebrating the graphic murder of individuals because they were Jewish, who were calling the conflict, quote unquote, brown on brown violence, who saw this as a chance for these two groups, each of which the white supremacists view as subhuman, to kill each other off. And so that was the initial reaction, right? Was this very celebratory glorifying of Hamas, glorifying the death of that many Jews. And as the month wore on, what you saw was an effort by many far-right groups, such as the active clubs, to co-mobilize to many of those pro-Palestine protests in the fall of 2023, not attempting to infiltrate or seed themselves in, but going as overt white supremacists, going as members of the active clubs, carrying banners that said no more wars for Israel, trying to align themselves, if not ideologically, then at least rhetorically in that moment, with so much of that popular messaging that was coming out of those protest spaces. And what the goal of many of those publicity stunts was to gain traction, was to get people talking about this group that's carrying this banner, and then trying to pull more people down that conspiratorial rabbit hole. And the other trend that I think is worth pointing out that's equally as concerning when we talk about the mainstream right wing was a very concerted effort by a lot of these right-wing influencers and grifters to position themselves as impartial reporters, as individuals who are sharing content that is purportedly from the conflict, but in reality is disinformation, is doctored video, is meant to inflame and further promote anti-Semitic conspiracies. You have individuals like Jackson Hinkle, for example, who prior to October 7th is promoting, deeply anti-Semitic white supremacist conspiracies, who immediately following October 7th, begins to attempt to, shift his brand into a war reporter influencer who's posting some of the most obviously doctored, obviously fake clips, but which are getting hundreds of thousands of views and interactions on X. And I think that the goal of many of those individuals was to use that as a springboard to promote their anti-Semitism, to attempt to appeal to what was an increasingly broad range of individuals who were, whether it was in good faith or bad faith, attempting to promote more information about the conflict, learn more about it. And so I think when you look at it, in each of those examples here, the commonality is attempting to leverage violence, attempting to leverage a conflict that has taken the lives of thousands and thousands of people to further that us versus them culture war, to further that idea that Jews are subhuman, are worthy of violence, that any Jewish individual should be a target, should be a legitimate target for violence. And unfortunately, as we've seen in recent months with the spike in anti-Semitism in the United States, that effort has been concerningly successful.
Duan, what are we talking about here? Like, what is the percentage of how many receptive people are to these conspiracies? I mean, it's very dangerous what you are saying. For example, comparing this to Germany, according to the German governmental coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, he said that of the overall population, 15% of the Germans are open to anti-Semitism. So let's talk in numbers. What's the situation in the United States?
I think we've certainly seen a range of data, a range of polling. I think there are a couple statistics that are important. The first I would point to is the testimony from FBI Director Wray, which has spoken of a massive spike, in the hundreds of percentages of reported anti-Semitic incidents, hate crimes. I think the other data point that's important when we take a step back and we talk about those conspiracies is the sheer number of Americans, right? And you've seen polling that talks about 20%, 30%, 35, 40%, even in some cases, who are, if not openly admitting to being anti-Semitic, are willing to buy in to anti-Semitic conspiracies, willing to accept some casual anti-Semitism as long as it's coming from the side that they think is promoting their worldview. And that goes for the conflict in Israel right now. That goes for perceptions around immigration at the border, perceptions around whether or not the Great Replacement theory is real, right? And that's something that has gone from a fringe neo-Nazi position that is, 5-6 years ago, you'd find that in 4chan chat rooms, and now is being repeated on the presidential debate stage, right? And I think when you broaden out that aperture and you have mainstream voices, whether it's presidential candidates, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's elected officials talking about Jewish space lasers, these casual embraces of anti-Semitism trickle down, right? They create that permissive environment for individuals who may not even consider themselves to be anti-Semitic, may not think that that they are individuals who hate Jewish people, but who, in that same breath, will tell you that there is a globalist conspiracy to replace the white population, will tell you that, any number of these conspiracies has a kernel of truth. And I think that when we talk about that mainstream in the United States, when we talk about the broader perceptions here that are so challenging, it's not just the individual far-right extremist groups. It's not the shadowy, neo-Nazi hacker behind a laptop screen that we see in all the articles, right? It's your neighbor. It's the person who, drives your mom to the doctor's appointment or mows your family's lawn. It's your neighbor. It's people who are increasingly willing to embrace that culture, embrace that us versus them mentality, and who increasingly are willing to accept the need for political violence against the other, whoever that may be, because the in-group in this situation on the right is being told time and time again that we, the in-group, are patriots. We are the white Christians who are trying to return this country to the true America that our Christian founding fathers had in mind when they signed the Declaration of Independence. And that mentality is unfortunately very pervasive, and it really does stoke so many of the fears, so many of these conspiracies, which really do boil down to that primal us versus them. And I think that again, in the broader context here, and you've talked about it on previous episodes, there is a long history of Jews being otherized, Jews not being viewed as part of that. They're not American enough. They're not white enough. They're not really part of this society that's being created here if they don't believe in your worldview. And I think that that's a very slippery slope when we talk about the perceptions around Jews, around Jewish people in this country, especially today.
John, there is something very important that I have been observing recently is how much of these conspiracy theories originating from the right-wing extremism in the United States being received in the Middle East, for example, and they are being reported to the Middle Eastern audiences as, look, these are authentic American voices, look what they are saying about the Jews. So I'm trying to talk here about, one, is that they are not just available on social media, they have platforms that allows them, they are very pervasive, and they are manipulative, that they can actually evade detection of the social media companies' policies and regulations. And what also struck me is that you say in the United States it's okay to be extremist, political extremist. I mean, all of these factors, like, how is this happening? I mean, why they are allowed on social media? Why such voices that glorify conspiracies against the Jews? I mean, the space laser is in itself is still like something. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, how is this being allowed on social media?
It is the free speech absolutism taken to the furthest edges of plausibility. If we were having this conversation 4 years ago in summer of 2020, I could at least point to efforts by Facebook, by Meta, right? They took targeted action that year, in that summer, against specific nodes of the Boogaloo movement after that network was linked to offline violence in the murder of a federal protective service officer outside a courthouse in Oakland, California. I could point to a similar action taken by Facebook against a specific QAnon network on Facebook, I believe in August of 2020. There were significant actions taken by social media platforms around COVID disinformation, around the election disinformation going into that election, although it's fair to say that was too little too late. But since then, you really have to sit back and ask yourself, on both the federal government side and on the social media platform side, have we learned any lessons? Are we any better off, any safer? Are there better policies in place? And as you go down that list, I think, unfortunately, the answer is unequivocally no in each of those cases. You've seen social media platforms take a step back and throw their hands up and say, this is too difficult. We're not going to try and do the same kind of content moderation that we did in 2020. And again, it's not even like the moderation that year was particularly effective, but we can at least point to specific examples where extremists were forced to move off of mainstream platforms, were forced to reinvent themselves, were forced to try and evade those bans. And again, it wasn't a silver bullet, it wasn't a perfect solution, but you could at least argue it slowed the spread of some of those violent conspiracy theories, right? When you take anti-Semitic influencers off of Facebook, off of Twitter, out of the YouTube and other video platforms, that closes that aperture a little bit, right? It makes it harder for the average American to accidentally stumble upon that, when they're just scrolling through YouTube and they go from, a Joe Rogan video to a Jordan Peterson video, and all of a sudden they're watching Alex Jones tell them that, the government is turning the frogs gay and that somehow it's the Jews' fault. But what we've seen in the last few years, I think, is a recognition by the far right that there aren't consequences for making these outlandish anti-Semitic statements, for promoting hateful conspiracy theories that inspire violence. There aren't consequences for inciting an insurrection, for attempting to attack the U.S. Capitol. We've seen that emboldens individuals. When you have elected officials who promote these conspiracies, that emboldens the average guy who's, sitting at home on Truth Social, watching his congressperson tell him that the FBI is corrupt and they're coming for you next, that the IRS has 87,000 armed agents that are coming to your town to take your gas stoves away from you, that Catholic charities are conspiring with the Jews to bring in migrants into this country. When that's coming from an attorney general's Twitter account, when that's coming from an elected official's social media platform, when that's coming from a voice that has a veneer of legitimacy, think about how far that extends. Think about how deep those ideas have been allowed to pervade into our society. And again, it's worth noting, of course, that it should be hard, right? This should be difficult for us to prevent the spread of this speech, right? We should not be able to just flip a switch and turn off the internet, right? We cannot, we have, I think, fairly, unique, important protections on speech and assembly in this country. And once we start rolling those back, it's awfully hard to get them again. But in the space of that, we're left with inaction, right? The Department of Homeland Security attempted to stand up a disinformation czar, Nina Jankowicz, who is a phenomenal expert on these things. I believe she lasted in that position a matter of weeks before there was a massive pushback from the right that ended up with the position being folded in. And that was pretty much the end of government efforts to address disinformation, hate speech online in the 4 years since 2020. And we're creeping closer to another election where, as we saw 4 years ago, anti-Semitic conspiracies are inevitably going to be a central piece of this. QAnon conspiracy theorists are going to be a central part of this. Individuals who are promoting casual hatred against the other is, already a centerpiece, whether you look at, conspiracies around the border, anti-LGBTQ hatred. These are all interconnected, right? And we really can't look at one of these without looking at the holistic spread of those conspiracies. And so, I think what's so challenging about this is, like we talked about earlier, it's not just one group, right? It's not just that there's this one specific hierarchical organization that is responsible for all the anti-Semitism in this country. It's both top down and bottom up. It's coming from social media platforms, both mainstream and fringe. It's coming from elected officials and neo-Nazis. And often they're saying the exact same thing. And when you have those,
on that, John, it's like, I think I need to ask you this question. I think there were attempts to inscribe the higher definition of anti-Semitism into a law in the United States. I mean, could this contribute to preventing anti-Semitism online? But the other question is, like, I understand that it's a very difficult task for the law enforcement because this requires legislations. Are there, and I also understand that this is also a question of the problem of the concept of freedom in the United States. Are there any discussions, debates among American philosophers, American scholars, American legislators to revisit the concept of freedom in the United States?
Yes, is the short answer, but I think, unfortunately, as is often the case when we talk about many of the legislative issues in the last couple of years, especially around the domestic extremism, domestic speech, it's inherently politicized, right? And there is always going to be the challenge of that slippery slope, right? Because the reality is we can't just ban speech that we find abhorrent. We can't just say that this specific kind of hateful speech is okay, but this kind of hateful speech is not. And I think that has really been at the center of a lot of these debates in recent years, right? It's been a lot of messaging by Congress. It's been a lot of these very boilerplate statements, right? And you look at the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. You look at the White House national strategy to counter domestic violent extremism. And it's a lot of very nice language, right? It hits the right notes. It talks about the need to address this holistically and understand the role of social media platforms in spreading this hatred. But time and time again, when push comes to shove, the execution is lacking. And I think that comes down to both the inherent politicization of both anti-Semitism and domestic extremism, as well as the reality, which is that it takes a lot of political will to move something like this forward. And when the terrorism warning lights, the extremism warning lights are blinking red across the whole dashboard, when we're simultaneously juggling, threats from Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, both FTOs and domestic violent extremist groups, when we have to grapple with an inherently mainstreamed anti-democratic threat that has been sweeping across this country, there are only so many problems that we can be expected to address at once. And of course, at the moment, I think the challenge is the government is not really addressing any of them coherently or holistically. But it really does speak to, I think, the inherent challenge here, which is that any legislation that's proposed around codifying this definition versus that definition, or enacting this crime or that crime, very quickly gets right into the middle of a very challenging political debate. And so what we're left with, in just keep it short here, is a law enforcement apparatus that has been very effective at disruption, has been stretched to its limits, trying to play whack-a-mole, right? Stopping the random guy up the street who is calling a synagogue 50 times, telling them he's going to come kill them. Dealing with the individual who is, threatening a rabbi or promoting anti-Semitic conspiracies or traveling interstate to threaten individuals outside of a mosque. But again, because it's individuals, because it's rarely groups, it's organic. It's coming from the bottom up. And as we see these resources, which are finite, being stretched to their breaking point before we even get into the election cycle, I think this really does speak to the totality of this threat, especially in the wake of October 7th.
Jon, we are left with 2 minutes and probably 20 seconds, but in my discussion with Europeans, they also refer to the fact that the American domestic extremism and right-wing extremism is also having an impact on their countries. But do you also see the other way around, that right-wing neo-Nazism, etc., in Europe is bringing the ideas to the United States?
Yes.
How do you see the situation?
It's certainly a bi-directional transfer. And I would say it's not, when we talk about like material support, right, where we're not seeing a flow of funds, of weapons, or anything of that nature explicitly, but we're seeing a transference of ideas, a transferal of grievances. And so when we see, especially with a lot of the English language, when we talk about siege culture, when we talk about terrorgram, we talk about this transnational neo-fascist movement that has spread, across the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and into mainland Europe itself, we see these universal ideas, right? The idea of accelerationism, the embrace of graphic, brutal violence for the sake of violence, with the hope that it will collapse the system. The propaganda, the glorification of American mass murderers, whether it's Timothy McVeigh, Charles Manson, the Columbine shooters, any of the kind of saints that we've talked about here, whether it's the Tree of Life, Poway, El Paso, Pittsburgh shooters, the violence that we've seen in the United States has been glorified and latched onto by far-right extremists, anti-Semites across the globe who see this as American exceptionalism. And I think that's deeply concerning. And I think that really does, again, show just how deep so many of these ideas have seeped.
Jon, I still have many questions, but unfortunately we don't have the time. Thank you for your insights and for also bringing me into a word that I am not familiar with. The word of right wing is really scary. So thank you again for your time and your insights.
Thank you so much, Omar.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.